We constantly buy into the golden illusion that immense talent acts as an impenetrable shield. When we look at the brightest black icons commanding the dazzling stage lights, we project onto them a picture-perfect family and a lifelong, untouchable reign of glory. But for many black child stars and cultural legends of the 1980s and 90s, their innate genius was merely a fragile ticket to a treacherous game with fate. The illusion shattered when a silent predator began quietly stalking the entertainment industry. It didn't discriminate between the fiercely liberated dancers of the underground Bronx or a gentle Hollywood giant suffering from a tragic medical accident. This merciless foe, the AIDS epidemic, quickly became the century's plague, turning vibrant, passionate lives into cheap tabloid fodder. Crushed by the systemic blade of severe racial prejudices and the paralyzing fear of stigma, these artists were forced into a devastating double life. They fought an invisible enemy in complete isolation, wasting away behind invisible walls to avoid public disgrace. Today, we unravel the raw agony and the chilling unanswered questions left behind by 11 brilliant black artists whose magnificent symphonies were brutally cut short. Jean Anthony Ray. Look closely at the frayed, sweat-drenched leg warmers preserved from the 1980 cinematic phenomenon fame. That tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of fabric held the explosive kinetic energy of a Bronx prodigy who appeared completely immune to gravity. Jean didn't just play Leroy Johnson. He was a living embodiment of instinctual, wild vitality, conquering the globe before his 20th birthday. It was the ultimate golden illusion, promising a lifetime of dazzling stage lights and unrivaled artistic supremacy. Yet, hovering just outside the camera's frame was a silent predator. The tragedy of his sudden drop wasn't born from a lack of talent, but from the unrestrained, feverish freedom of the 1980s nightclub culture. During an era where safe sex education was practically non-existent and public discourse was entirely choked by the fear of stigma, his youthful naivety inadvertently opened the door to the century's plague. Contracting HIV was the ultimate invisible punishment for a man whose entire language of expression was physical motion. The raw agony that followed was a grueling, slow-motion demolition. AIDS methodically eroded his unparalleled physical fortress. The muscular legs that once violently tore across stages were reduced to fragile skin over bones, and his breathtaking leaps devolved into heavy, labored breathing. When he finally succumbed to a fatal stroke in 2003 at the tragically young age of 41, the medical report offered a clinical cause of death. But the cold, forensic truth remains. His meticulously crafted biological engine was hijacked and entirely dismantled by a microscopic invader. The brutal physical betrayal witnessed on those sprawling, chaotic dance floors merely served as a grim overture. Miles away, perfectly shielded behind the heavily manicured, highly sanitized sets of primetime sitcom television, another beloved prodigy was frantically calculating exactly how long he could maintain his own flawless facade before the audience noticed his quiet decay. Franklin Seals. Millions of American televisions in the 1980s were tuned in to the roaring, wholesome laughter of the hit sitcom Silver Spoons. At the absolute zenith of this cultural phenomenon stood Franklin, a former child prodigy who successfully navigated the grueling industry to command the forgiving spotlight. Having already delivered a heavyweight cinematic performance in The Onion field, he was the living embodiment of the golden illusion, projecting the warmth of a picture-perfect family into living rooms nationwide. Yet, the higher the pedestal, the more devastating the sudden drop. Just as his ratings peaked and his career seemed eternally bulletproof, an invisible enemy breached his reality. In an era paralyzed by the fear of stigma and devoid of mainstream public health education, Franklin contracted HIV. The systemic blade of prejudice meant revealing his earth-shattering secret would instantly transform a beloved national treasure into cheap tabloid fodder. Terrified of public disgrace, he fought this merciless foe entirely in the shadows. The raw agony of his final years was a horrifying contrast to his televised comedic timing. The vibrant actor was rapidly wasting away. Rigorous theater rehearsals agonizingly morphed into desperate medical treatments as his immune system failed him. He passed away in 1990 at merely 37 years old, an age reserved for an actor's highest accolades, not an untimely obituary. What is the true value of entertaining a world that would eagerly exile you the moment they discovered your mortal suffering? The echoing, canned laughter of the sterile television studio inevitably dissolved into a deafening, tragic silence. That exact same suffocating quiet would soon completely envelop the fiercely competitive underground ballrooms of New York, where a completely different kind of royalty was unknowingly voguing straight into the arms of the plague. Willie Ninja. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating heat of a 1980s New York underground ballroom, completely mesmerized. When Willie stepped onto the floor, he didn't just dance. He painted absolute freedom with his body, seizing the forgiving spotlight and establishing himself as an untouchable icon. We all believed he was invincible, perfectly embodying the golden illusion of a self-made king who could bend the world's gaze to his will. But amidst the intoxicating rhythm and blinding flashes of our underground sanctuary, a silent predator was quietly circulating through the crowd. In an era where the systemic blade of racial prejudices completely marginalized us, the lack of medical knowledge turned our fiercely liberated nights into a fatal trap. I watched in devastating raw agony over the years as this merciless foe, the century's plague, slowly dismantled his majestic frame. The illusion shattered not with a scandal, but with the quiet terror of him wasting away. Even as his body was reduced to skin over bones and he was left gasping for air, I saw the unyielding pride blazing in his eyes. He refused to let his earth-shattering secret become mere tabloid fodder for a society that despised him. He passed away in 2006, enduring the invisible punishment of an era that allowed its most brilliant stars to burn out in the dark. When the thumping bass of the ballroom finally powers down and the heavy velvet curtains fall, we are left in a crushing, suffocating silence. This exact same agonizing stillness would soon claim the life of a brilliant wordsmith, permanently silencing a generation's poetic roar. Essex Hemphill. I am the cold steel microphone that once amplified the roaring voice of an entire generation. When Essex gripped me in the 1980s, he projected the golden illusion of an untouchable icon, an intellectual powerhouse leading the charge in documentaries like Tongues Untied. He didn't need dazzling stage lights to captivate the masses. His razor-sharp words were enough. But while his intellect soared, he was still human, deeply intertwined in a fiercely liberated nightlife. The systemic blade of racial prejudices and severe government apathy had built invisible walls around his community, intentionally withholding crucial medical education. This systemic neglect created a fatal blind spot. The sudden drop came quietly. By simply seeking genuine connection in the dark, he unknowingly invited a silent predator. The century's plague was a merciless foe that didn't care about his profound poetic genius. As the years passed, I physically felt his once confident grip on my steel frame grow agonizingly weak. He endured the raw agony of wasting away, his thunderous voice slowly reducing to labored breathing. He refused to let his earth-shattering secret become cheap tabloid fodder or bow to the crushing fear of stigma. Even when he was just skin over bones and gasping for air, he used his rapidly fading strength to document his own demise. He passed away in 1995, receiving the ultimate invisible punishment for living fully in a perilous era. Now, I stand completely silent in an empty room, an inanimate witness to a genius whose symphony was muted too soon. This heavy, metallic stillness eventually bled into the desolate editing bays of San Francisco, where a visionary director prepared to weaponize his own decaying body for one final, devastating artistic statement. Marlon Riggs. The final cut of his life played out not on a glamorous red carpet, but in a sterile hospital room where every command he shouted was accompanied by labored breathing. In 1994, Marlon Riggs was rapidly wasting away, his body ravaged by a merciless foe as he directed his final documentary, Black Is, Black Ain't, directly from his deathbed. Before this devastating sudden drop, he possessed the ultimate golden illusion, a celebrated, razor-sharp intellectual powerhouse who used his camera to dissect society. He was expected to enjoy a long, untouchable reign in the forgiving spotlight of academia and independent film. But during the 1980s, Marlon immersed himself deeply into the vibrant, fiercely liberated gay nightlife of New York and San Francisco. In an era where the systemic blade of government apathy intentionally kept marginalized communities entirely blind to the century's plague, the concept of safe sex was virtually non-existent. Through his pursuit of unrestrained personal freedom, an invisible enemy quietly infiltrated his system. He was handed a literal death sentence. Yet, instead of retreating behind invisible walls or bowing to the fear of stigma and public disgrace, Marlon turned his camera on himself. He boldly weaponized his own raw agony. He documented his physical transformation into fragile skin over bones, refusing to let his earth-shattering secret be reduced to whispered tabloid fodder. He forcefully shoved the grim reality of his invisible punishment directly into the faces of an apathetic society. He died with his masterpiece unfinished, proving that true immortality isn't about physically outliving a disease, but forcing the entire world to witness your unyielding, brutal truth. This fierce dedication to continuing the performance until the absolute bitter end would soon be mirrored under the bright, artificial studio lights of a beloved television drama, where another star was quietly suffering in complete silence. Larry Riley. Paranoia is a relentless, suffocating ghost that haunts every dressing room mirror, poisoning the mind before the body even realizes it is dying. Long before his physical collapse, Larry waged a terrifying, exhausting psychological war inside his own head. On the surface, he perfectly embodied the golden illusion, projecting the image of a seasoned powerhouse and an untouchable icon on prestigious Broadway stages and the hit television series Knots Landing. He was heavily viewed as a steadfast beacon of black excellence, warmly basking in the mainstream's forgiving spotlight. But a silent predator was quietly stalking his every move. The earth-shattering secret of his HIV status, unknowingly contracted during the epidemic's chaotic peak, forced him into a torturous double life. The systemic blade of the conservative 1990s entertainment industry offered absolutely no mercy. He knew that revealing his illness would instantly trigger irreversible public disgrace and reduce his hard-earned legacy to cruel tabloid fodder. Driven by a desperate need to preserve his dignity, he built impenetrable, invisible walls. He bravely endured the raw agony of total renal failure, a devastating complication of the century's plague, in absolute silence. His co-stars merely saw a vibrant Frank Williams whenever the director yelled action. Completely unaware that underneath the carefully tailored wardrobe, Larry was literally wasting away, his magnificent frame rapidly reduced to frail skin over bones. He dragged himself to the set daily, gasping for air between takes, driven solely by the pure desire to work. The invisible punishment of this forced secrecy meant he suffered profound isolation while surrounded by millions of adoring fans. He passed away at just 38 years old in 1992. The most devastating truth of a marginalized artist's existence is that the crushing fear of stigma systematically murders their spirit long before the actual disease claims their physical body. This profound, solitary exhaustion experienced on the sterile television lot eventually dissolved into the dizzying, neon-lit chaos of the music industry's most intoxicating era, where an entirely different rhythm concealed a similarly fatal trap. Jermaine Stewart. The devastating end didn't come with a soaring vocal note, but with the suffocating silence of liver failure in 1997. When this fatal complication of the century's plague claimed him, the R&B sensation was reduced to fragile skin over bones. He endured the raw agony of a merciless foe hollowing him out from the inside. This collapse was a horrific contrast to his absolute zenith. Before the sudden drop, Jermaine was a powerhouse on Soul Train, a prodigy bathed in dazzling stage lights. He projected the ultimate golden illusion, seemingly destined for a permanent reign in the forgiving spotlight. But the 1980s entertainment machine was a disguised death trap. While promoting extreme personal freedom, the systemic blade of government apathy ensured life-saving medical education was buried. Within those intoxicating nightclub corners, he unknowingly met a silent predator. Contracting HIV wasn't a reckless gamble. It was an invisible punishment inflicted by an era allowing its youth to dance straight into a massacre. Paralyzed by the fear of stigma, he knew the illness would transform his legacy into cheap tabloid fodder. He maintained a grueling double life, rapidly wasting away and gasping for air. He fiercely protected his earth-shattering secret to avoid public disgrace. He died at 39. The brutal irony of fame is that the industry endlessly replays your hits long after abandoning you in the dark. This fading musical frequency soon yielded to the intensely rigid atmosphere of a cinematic academy, where an Oscar-nominated heavyweight quietly waged an identical, devastating war. Howard Rollins. One prestigious Academy Award nomination. Dozens of critically acclaimed theater performances. Millions of weekly viewers glued to in the heat of the night. These were the staggering metrics that built his golden illusion. At his zenith, Howard was a certified powerhouse, bathing in the forgiving spotlight and redefining the standard for Black cinematic excellence. But the arithmetic of fame is inherently cruel, heavily masking the devastating numbers of a completely different reality. The sudden drop wasn't calculated in plummeting television ratings, but in the rapid, terrifying drop of his T-cell count. In an era where the systemic blade of societal ignorance meant an HIV diagnosis was an immediate death sentence, Howard's earth-shattering secret forced him into an agonizing double life. To avoid the invisible punishment of industry exile and becoming vicious tabloid fodder, he maintained total silence for years. He waged a grueling war against a silent predator, enduring the raw agony of severe lymphoma. The cold statistics of his decline were meticulously hidden beneath tailored suits as he slowly transformed into skin over bones. He fiercely refused to let his fear of stigma or the threat of public disgrace diminish his professional output. He worked relentlessly until he was literally gasping for air, hiding his merciless foe from even his closest colleagues. When he passed away in 1996 at exactly 46 years old, the world lost a titanic talent to an epidemic that demanded an unpayable, fatal tax on an entire generation. The brutal calculation is clear. The industry extracts every ounce of an artist's brilliance, while offering absolutely zero sanctuary for their suffering. This agonizing mathematical equation of hidden decay on Hollywood soundstages soon shifted to a sterile surgical theater, where a massive, gentle giant was about to be betrayed by the very numbers meant to save his life. Kevin Peter Hall. A single, devastating moment on a sterile operating table completely sealed his fate, proving how rapidly a life can unravel. Standing at an imposing 7'2", Kevin projected the golden illusion of an indestructible Hollywood powerhouse. Having famously embodied the iconic extraterrestrial hunter opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger in the blockbuster Predator, he securely basked in the forgiving spotlight of international stardom. His career trajectory seemed entirely bulletproof until a horrific car crash in the late 1980s triggered a catastrophic ripple effect. To immediately save his life, frantic emergency doctors administered a routine blood transfusion. But in an era severely lacking stringent medical screening, that one life-saving measure unknowingly delivered a silent predator directly into his veins. The tainted blood carried HIV, initiating a terribly cruel sudden drop that completely derailed his towering existence. Unlike many of his contemporaries, his earth-shattering secret wasn't born from the dark, chaotic corners of unrestrained nightlife, but from a fatal flaw within a broken healthcare system. The systemic blade of medical negligence had inadvertently handed a gentle giant an absolute death sentence. Rather than succumbing to the paralyzing fear of stigma or allowing his personal tragedy to become cheap tabloid fodder, Kevin faced his invisible enemy with astonishing grace. He quietly endured the raw agony of the century's plague as it ruthlessly hollowed out his massive frame, painfully reducing the beloved titan to fragile skin over bones. He was left repeatedly gasping for air, hiding his merciless foe behind an unwavering, warm smile until he passed away in 1991 at merely 35 years old. A single roll of the medical dice in a trauma ward brutally reminds us of the terrifying fragility of human life. Sometimes, survival is just an illusion waiting to be shattered. The cold, tragic stillness of that devastating hospital room eventually dissolved into the pulsating, feverish rhythms of San Francisco's nightlife, where a dazzling, gender-defying voice was preparing to dance straight into the epicenter of the epidemic. Sylvester, the entertainment machine, ruthlessly commodifies rebellion, eagerly profiting off marginalized bodies while offering them zero sanctuary. As a gender-defying powerhouse and the reigning queen of 1970s disco, Sylvester was treated as a highly profitable asset. With a soaring falsetto commanding the dazzling stage lights in the film The Rose, he achieved the golden illusion of mainstream acceptance. Society heavily consumed his boundary-shattering persona, treating him as an untouchable icon as long as the music kept playing. But the systemic blade of 1980s America was profoundly hypocritical. When the century's plague infiltrated San Francisco's fiercely liberated nightlife, the government entirely abandoned the gay community. Forced to navigate this engineered ignorance, Sylvester unknowingly fell victim to a silent predator. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was an invisible punishment inflicted by an establishment viewing his existence as entirely expendable. As the merciless foe ravaged his body, reducing him to skin over bones, the industry swiftly turned its back, ready to reduce his legacy to cheap tabloid fodder. Yet, he forcefully refused to hide in raw agony. Even while wasting away and gasping for air, he proudly paraded his decaying body in a wheelchair at the 1988 Gay Pride Parade, fiercely rejecting the fear of stigma and public disgrace. He passed away that exact same year. The ultimate cruelty of Hollywood is that it only mourns the martyrs it deliberately helped create. This defiant, highly public spectacle of a dying monarch soon faded into the quiet corners of a cramped New York apartment, where a legendary matriarch was meticulously stitching her own armor against the encroaching dark. Dorian Corey. Zoom in on a single, rusted sewing needle left abandoned beside a half-finished sequined gown in a cramped New York apartment. That tiny, unremarkable piece of sharp steel was the foundational tool used to build a golden illusion. Dorian wasn't just a performer. She was a philosopher and the fiercely protective matriarch of the underground ballroom scene famously documented in Paris is Burning. She meticulously stitched together a picture-perfect family for the city's discarded LGBTQ+ youth, offering them the forgiving spotlight they were violently denied elsewhere. But beneath the glamorous, dizzying veneer of the 1980s ballroom culture, a silent predator was quietly circulating. In an era where the systemic blade of government apathy and severe racial prejudices deliberately withheld life-saving medical information, the deeply liberated nightlife she dedicated her life to became a fatal trap. The sudden drop occurred silently. She unknowingly contracted the century's plague from the very dark corners of the culture she championed. Dorian fiercely locked her earth-shattering secret away, to spare her vulnerable children from the paralyzing fear of stigma and the invisible punishment of the disease. She endured her raw agony in complete isolation. Even as she was rapidly wasting away and reduced to skin over bones, she remained anchored to her sewing machine. Despite trembling hands and labored breathing, she refused to become tragic tabloid fodder. She passed away in 1993 from AIDS complications. The cold, forensic truth remains. The very community that provided these marginalized artists their only taste of absolute freedom was also the silent battleground where they were ruthlessly slaughtered. These 11 brilliant souls were promised the golden illusion of eternal stardom, but their devastating physical transformations under the crushing weight of the century's plague revealed a much darker reality. They were ultimately victims of a systemic blade that prioritized the fear of stigma and public disgrace over saving human lives. As we look back at their monumental legacies, we are left with haunting unanswered questions about the masterpieces we lost to this merciless foe. Their stories serve as a chilling reminder that behind every towering icon is a fragile human fighting a terrifying invisible enemy in the dark. If their tragic, hidden battles moved you, do not let their memories remain buried as forgotten tabloid fodder. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to ensure their true, unapologetic legacies forever remain in the forgiving spotlight.